The rifle's explosion should have killed the grizzly, but instead it shattered in Daniel Crow Feather's hands, sending white-hot metal fragments tearing through his shoulder and chest. Blood sprayed across the October snow as he collapsed, his hunting knife clattering uselessly beside him while the wounded bear disappeared into the Colorado wilderness. His children's faces appeared at the cabin window 50 yards away. 3 small silhouettes pressed against frost-covered glass, watching their father fall. 8-year-old Joseph Two Eagles dropped the firewood he'd been stacking, his mouth forming a silent scream that cut through the mountain air like a blade. Mary Little Dove's tiny hands pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered, "Papa," over and over. The same desperate plea she'd made 8 months ago when tuberculosis stole their mother. 3-year-old Samuel Young Wolf began to wail, a sound that echoed off the pine trees and seemed to summon every nightmare Daniel had carried since Rebecca Singing Bird's death. "Get inside and bar the door," Daniel gasped, his vision blurring as he crawled toward the cabin through snow now crimson with his blood. Who would protect his children now? And how long did they have before the bear returned? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Daniel Crow Feather had been a different man, one who believed the worst was behind him. The silver mine where he'd worked part-time had still been operating then, providing steady income to supplement his hunting and trapping. Rebecca Singing Bird had been alive, her laughter filling their modest log cabin as she taught their children the old Cherokee songs her grandmother had passed down. The $300 debt to Pine Ridge Bank had seemed manageable, a temporary burden they'd overcome together. Now, as autumn painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel faced a harsh reality that seemed determined to crush what remained of his family. The mine had closed permanently in August, taking with it the jobs of half the town's men. His hunting income barely covered food and basic supplies, let alone the mounting debt that threatened to steal their home. 30 days. That's all the bank had given him to pay in full or face foreclosure. Daniel stood 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a man who'd earned his living through physical labor, his Lakota heritage evident in his dark hair and weathered bronze skin. His Scottish blood showed in his green eyes, the same eyes that had once sparkled with hope but now carried the weight of a man drowning in responsibilities he couldn't meet. At 34, he felt decades older, aged by grief and the relentless pressure of raising 3 children alone. Joseph Two Eagles, at 8 years old, had grown serious beyond his years since his mother's death. He chopped wood with grim determination, his small hands already showing calluses as he tried to fill the role of man of the house. Mary Little Dove, 5 years old, with her mother's gentle spirit, often stared out the window as if waiting for Rebecca to return from some long journey. She'd stopped singing the Cherokee lullabies, claiming they made her too sad inside. 3-year-old Samuel Young Wolf still asked for Mama every morning, his innocent questions like daggers in Daniel's heart. The cabin itself reflected their struggle. Once warm and welcoming under Rebecca's care, it now felt hollow despite Daniel's efforts to maintain it. Meals were simple affairs of whatever game he could catch, supplemented by dwindling supplies from their root cellar. The children's clothes were patched and repatched. Their shoes would barely last through winter, and Daniel knew that his own worn boots had maybe one more season left in them. Each morning brought the same crushing weight of inadequacy. How could he be both mother and father to children who needed more than his rough hands and awkward attempts at tenderness could provide? The mountain wilderness that had once felt like freedom now seemed like a prison, isolating them from the help they desperately needed. The morning of October 15th had started like any other, with Daniel checking his traps before dawn while the children slept. The grizzly's tracks near Willow Creek told a story of desperation. Claw marks on trees where the bear had tried to reach late-season berries, scat that showed it hadn't been eating well. A hungry bear this close to winter was dangerous, especially with 3 children in an isolated cabin. Daniel had tracked the massive creature for 2 hours through dense pine forest, following blood drops where it had caught its paw in one of his smaller traps. The bear was wounded, which made it even more unpredictable. When he finally spotted it near a fallen log, the animal was clearly suffering. Foam around its muzzle, labored breathing, one front paw held awkwardly. The humane thing was to end its misery quickly. But his father's old rifle, reliable for 15 years, chose that moment to fail catastrophically. The barrel had split along an invisible crack, turning what should have been a clean kill shot into an explosion that sent metal fragments slicing through his body like heated knives. The bear, startled by the blast, had fled deeper into the wilderness, leaving Daniel bleeding in the snow. Now, as he crawled toward his cabin with his strength ebbing, Daniel's mind raced through terrible calculations. The nearest neighbor was old Henrik Mueller, a half-mile through rough terrain. The doctor lived in Clearwater, a full day's ride even for a healthy man. His children were alone, defenseless, and if he passed out from blood loss before reaching them, "Papa! Papa!" Joseph's voice cracked with panic as he burst through the cabin door, his 8-year-old frame trembling with shock at the sight of his father's blood-soaked clothes. Mary and Samuel huddled behind him, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Daniel collapsed against the porch steps, his vision swimming. "Joseph, listen to me," he gasped, each word a monumental effort. "Take your brother and sister inside. Bar the door. Don't come out until I tell you." "But Papa, you're hurt." Mary's voice rose to a wail that seemed to echo off every tree in the surrounding forest. "I'll be fine, little dove," Daniel lied, tasting copper in his mouth. "Just need to rest a minute." That's when they heard the hoofbeats. Through the pain and gathering darkness at the edges of his vision, Daniel saw a lone rider approaching on a chestnut mare. At first he thought it might be Henrik, but the figure was too small, too graceful in the saddle. As the rider drew closer, he could make out a woman in a dark riding dress, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet. A leather satchel was tied behind her saddle, and more importantly, something wrapped in cloth that looked suspiciously like— "Dear Lord in heaven," the woman breathed, dismounting with practiced ease as she took in the scene before her. She moved toward Daniel with quick, confident steps, her hands already reaching for the satchel at her side. "Sir, what happened? Children, step back please, but don't be afraid." Daniel tried to focus on her face, but the world kept tilting sideways. "Ma'am, you shouldn't. Dangerous here. Bear got away, might come back." "A bear did this?" She knelt beside him, her hands moving with surprising skill as she examined his wounds. "No, this is metal fragments. Rifle malfunction, I'd guess. I'm Sarah Running Bear, and I have medical training. Can you tell me your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel Crow Feather," he managed, struck by how calm her voice was despite the gravity of the situation. "These are my children. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you if I can help it," Sarah said firmly, already tearing strips from her petticoat to create makeshift bandages. "Joseph, is it? I need you to be very brave and help me. Can you fetch some clean water?" The boy nodded mutely, his face pale but determined as he ran toward the well. Sarah's hands worked with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to the worst wounds while speaking in soothing tones to Mary and Samuel, who watched from the doorway. "You have beautiful children, Mr. Crow Feather. They're being very brave right now. My wife, she died 8 months ago," Daniel whispered, not sure why he felt compelled to share this with a stranger. "They've been through enough." Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment, something flickering across her face too quickly for him to interpret. "Then we'll make sure they don't have to go through losing their father, too," she said, her voice carrying a determination that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. As consciousness finally slipped away from him, Daniel's last clear thought was of the strange coincidence that had brought this capable woman to their remote cabin at exactly the moment they needed her most. In his fading awareness, he caught the scent of fresh-baked bread from her saddlebags, a smell that reminded him painfully of Rebecca's kitchen on Sunday mornings. Daniel drifted back to consciousness in waves, each one bringing fresh awareness of pain and an unfamiliar scent of herbs and fresh bread. Sunlight streamed through his cabin's window at an angle that told him hours had passed, and for a disorienting moment he thought he heard Rebecca humming softly in the kitchen. Then reality crashed back. Rebecca was gone. He'd been injured, and there had been a stranger. "Easy now," came a gentle voice as he tried to sit up. Sarah Running Bear appeared at his bedside, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You've lost a fair amount of blood, Mr. Crow Feather. The worst fragments are out, but you need to stay still." Daniel's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in details that seemed both familiar and foreign. His children sat quietly at the kitchen table, eating what appeared to be fresh bread with honey. Mary was actually smiling, something he hadn't seen in weeks. Samuel had honey smeared across his cheek, and even Joseph looked less burdened than usual. "How long was I out?" Daniel's voice came out as a croak. "About 6 hours. It's past supper time." Sarah moved with easy familiarity around his cabin, checking his bandages with gentle but sure hands. "I've cleaned and dressed your wounds. You're fortunate. Most of the fragments were shallow, though one piece near your shoulder will need watching for infection." Daniel studied her face as she worked, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way his children had already grown comfortable with her presence. There was something about Sarah Running Bear that didn't quite fit. Her clothes were well made but practical, her hands soft enough to suggest education but calloused in ways that spoke of real work. Most puzzling was how naturally she'd stepped into his home, as if she belonged there. "Ma'am, I'm grateful for your help, but I have to ask, what brings you to Pine Ridge?" "We don't get many travelers, especially not women riding alone." Sarah's hands paused for just a moment before continuing to adjust his bandages. "I'm the new school teacher. The school board hired me to establish a proper school here, though I understand the building needs significant repairs before we can begin classes." "You came all the way from Denver for that?" Daniel found himself studying her profile, noting the way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. "That's quite a commitment for a town most people are trying to leave." "Sometimes a place calls to you," Sarah replied, finally looking at him directly. Her eyes were an unusual shade of brown, flecked with gold that reminded him of autumn leaves. "Besides, where else would I have the chance to make such a real difference in children's lives?" Joseph approached the bed cautiously, his small face creased with worry. "Papa, Miss Sarah says you can't work for a few days. What about the traps?" "What about the bank?" Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of his responsibilities crushing down on him again. Henrik Muller might check the traps for him, but the old German had his own problems. As for the bank, 25 days now until foreclosure. "We'll figure something out, son." "Actually," Sarah interjected, "I was thinking I might stay a few days to help. Since the school repairs will take at least a week to complete, I find myself with unexpected time. If you'd permit it, I could assist with meals and watching the children while you recover." Daniel's eyes snapped open. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I couldn't impose on your kindness like that. You've already done more than enough." "It wouldn't be an imposition. Honestly, it would be a blessing." Sarah moved to the kitchen, where she began ladling what smelled like rabbit stew into bowls. "I've been traveling alone for weeks." "The company would be welcome." "People will talk," Daniel said quietly, conscious of his children listening. An unmarried woman staying with a widower, It's not proper." Sarah set down the ladle and turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Mr. Crowfeather, your children need care. You need time to heal, and frankly, propriety seems less important than keeping a family together. As for what people say," she shrugged, "I've learned that people who have time to gossip usually don't have enough real work to occupy their minds." Mary tugged on Sarah's skirt, looking up at her with hope shining in her dark eyes. "Are you going to stay, Miss Sarah? Will you tell us more stories like Mama used to?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. Mary hadn't asked for bedtime stories since Rebecca's death, claiming they made her too sad. Yet here she was, already forming an attachment to this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. "I'd like to stay, if your papa says it's all right," Sarah said gently, smoothing Mary's hair with a touch so natural it might have been instinctive. Samuel toddled over, holding up his arms to be lifted. Without hesitation, Sarah scooped him up, settling him on her hip as if she'd been doing it all his life. "Miss Sawa make good bread," he declared with 3-year-old authority. "The best bread I've ever tasted," Joseph added solemnly, and Daniel realized his eldest son had already eaten 2 thick slices. Daniel watched this domestic scene unfold with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Sarah Running Bear seemed too good to be true, arriving at exactly the right moment with exactly the skills they needed. In his experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Yet his children were smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in months. 3 days, he said finally, until I can get around properly. "But I'll sleep in the barn to preserve your reputation." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "You're injured and need to stay warm. I'll make a bed by the fireplace. It's perfectly appropriate." As evening settled over the cabin, Daniel found himself watching Sarah move about his home with growing wonder. She seemed to anticipate his children's needs before they voiced them, helping Mary with her hair, showing Joseph how to bank the fire properly, singing soft Cherokee lullabies to Samuel that somehow, impossibly, she knew the words to. When she thought no one was looking, Daniel caught her touching Rebecca's wooden spoon with reverent fingers, her expression filled with a sadness that seemed to match his own. Who was Sarah Running Bear, really? And why did her presence feel less like a coincidence and more like an answer to prayers he'd been too proud to voice? The 3 days Daniel had reluctantly agreed to became a week, then stretched into 2 as autumn deepened around Pine Ridge. Each morning brought subtle changes to their routine, Sarah rising before dawn to tend the fire and start breakfast, the children gravitating toward her warmth like flowers turning toward the sun, and Daniel finding excuses to delay his return to full activity. His wounds were healing well under Sarah's careful attention, but something deeper was mending too. The cabin that had felt hollow and cheerless since Rebecca's death now hummed with quiet contentment. Sarah's presence seemed to breathe life back into corners that had grown cold, and Daniel caught himself looking forward to each day in ways he'd forgotten were possible. On a crisp morning in early November, Daniel sat on the porch steps watching Sarah teach the children to identify different bird calls. She moved with grace through the fallen leaves, pointing out the differences between a jay's harsh cry and a robin's liquid song. Mary hung on her every word while Samuel chased after butterflies with delighted squeals. Even Joseph, who'd grown so serious since his mother's death, was laughing at something Sarah whispered in his ear. "Papa, did you know Miss Sarah can speak 4 languages?" Joseph called out, his face bright with admiration. "She taught me to count to 10 in Cherokee and Irish." Daniel smiled, noting how his son's posture had straightened in recent days, how the weight of premature responsibility seemed to be lifting from his young shoulders. "Is that so? What else has Miss Sarah been teaching you?" "She knows all the old stories Mama used to tell," Mary said, running to sit beside her father. "But she knows different endings. Better endings." "Better how, little dove?" Mary's face grew thoughtful. "In Miss Sarah's stories, people don't just disappear. They go on adventures and come back home." The innocent words hit Daniel with unexpected force. Rebecca hadn't gone on an adventure, she'd simply faded away day by day until the tuberculosis finally claimed her. But he understood what Mary meant. Sarah's stories offered hope where Rebecca's death had left only absence. That evening, as Sarah helped the children prepare for bed, Daniel found himself studying her with new eyes. She moved through their bedtime routine with instinctive understanding, knowing without being told that Joseph needed extra time to bank the fires properly, that Mary required a song to chase away nightmares, that Samuel wouldn't sleep without his wooden horse clutched tightly in his small fist. "You're very good with them," Daniel said quietly as Sarah emerged from the children's room. "They're easy to love," she replied, settling into Rebecca's old rocking chair by the fire. The sight should have pained him, but instead it felt right, as if the chair had been waiting for someone worthy to fill it again. Daniel poured himself coffee and offered her a cup, which she accepted with grateful hands. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the settling of logs in the walls. "Miss Sarah," Daniel said finally, "I have to ask you something that's been weighing on my mind." She looked up, her hands stilling on the mug. "Of course. Why did you really come to Pine Ridge? I've been thinking about it and something doesn't add up. This town is dying, the mine's closed, half the families have already moved on. What school board would send their best teacher to a place that might not exist in 6 months?" Sarah was quiet for so long Daniel wondered if she'd heard the question. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes people end up where they need to be, not where they plan to go." "That's not really an answer." She set down her coffee and looked directly at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're right. You deserve the truth, especially after welcoming me into your home." She took a shaky breath. "I did come to teach school, but not because any board hired me. I heard about Pine Ridge from a woman in Denver, a woman who was dying of tuberculosis in the charity hospital." Daniel's blood went cold. "What woman?" "Her name was Rebecca Singing Bird," Sarah said softly. "She was your wife, Daniel. And in her final days she made me promise something that changed the course of my entire life." The coffee cup slipped from Daniel's numb fingers, shattering on the floor. "That's impossible. Rebecca died here, in our bed. I was holding her hand." "She did die here," Sarah agreed, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. "But 3 weeks before her death, you took her to Denver to see that specialist, remember? When the doctor said there was nothing more to be done?" Daniel's mind reeled back to those desperate final days, when he'd spent their last savings on train tickets and a hotel room, clinging to hope that city doctors might offer a miracle. Rebecca had insisted on one afternoon alone, said she wanted to pray at the cathedral while he met with the financial officer about payment plans. He'd been gone for 3 hours. "She came to the charity hospital," Sarah continued, "not as a patient but to volunteer in the children's ward. She said helping others made her feel useful when her own body was failing her." "But why? Why would she go there?" "Because she'd heard about a teacher who'd lost her own child and was working with orphaned children. She wanted to meet me." Sarah's voice broke. "She wanted to ask me something impossible." Daniel felt the world tilting around him. "What did she ask you?" "To find her family after she was gone, to make sure her children were loved and cared for. She said she'd been watching you from the hospital window some days, and she could see how lost you'd become trying to be everything to everyone." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. "You mean you didn't just happen to find me bleeding in the snow?" You came here specifically to fulfill a dying woman's last request, yes. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Rebecca gave me detailed directions to your cabin, told me about each of your children's personalities, even taught me her bread recipe. She said the smell of fresh bread always made your house feel like home. Daniel stared at her, his mind struggling to process this impossible information. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? Because I wasn't sure you'd trust me if you knew, and honestly, I wasn't sure I could go through with it. The last child I tried to help? Sarah's voice trailed off and she wrapped her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. What happened? I was working at an orphanage in Denver. There was a fire. Her voice became flat, mechanical. I managed to save most of the children, but there was one little girl, Emma, who was too frightened to leave her hiding place. I tried to go back for her, but the floor collapsed. She died because I wasn't brave enough, wasn't fast enough. Daniel saw the pain etched in every line of Sarah's face and understood suddenly why she'd seemed so determined to help his family. That's why you came here. You're trying to save someone you couldn't save before. Maybe, Sarah admitted. Or maybe Rebecca saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She said I had too much love left to give to waste it on guilt and regret. They sat in silence as this revelation settled between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was approaching with its usual relentless determination. The bank notice came today, Daniel said eventually. 20 days left before foreclosure. Even if I could get back to hunting full-time tomorrow, I can't make $300 in 20 days. What if you didn't have to? Daniel looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Sarah rose and walked to her traveling bag, pulling out a small leather pouch. I have money saved from my teaching positions in Denver. It's not much, but it's enough to cover your debt to the bank. Absolutely not. Daniel stood so quickly his injuries protested with sharp pain. I won't take charity, especially not from someone I barely know. It's not charity, Sarah said firmly. It's an investment in the future, in these children's future. An investment in what? A failing homestead? And a broken-down hunter who can't even protect his own family from a hungry bear? Sarah crossed the room and took his hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. An investment in a man who'd track a dangerous animal to protect his children, in a father who'd crawl through snow with metal fragments in his chest rather than leave his family unprotected, in a home where love still lives, even in the middle of heartbreak. Daniel looked down at their joined hands, noting the calluses on her palms that spoke of real work, real struggle. Why would you do this? What's in it for you? A chance to keep the promise I made to your wife. A chance to be part of something beautiful instead of just surviving from day to day. She met his eyes directly. A chance to find out if I'm brave enough to love again, even knowing it might end in loss. The honesty in her words took his breath away. Sarah, You don't have to decide anything tonight, she said gently. Just think about it. Think about what Rebecca would want for her children. Think about what you want for them. As if summoned by the mention of their mother, Mary's small voice drifted from the bedroom. Papa, Miss Sarah, I had the dream again. Without hesitation, both adults moved toward the children's room. Daniel watched Sarah kneel beside his daughter's bed, smoothing her hair and murmuring comfort in the same gentle tones Rebecca had once used. Mary's breathing settled and she drifted back to peaceful sleep. Standing in the doorway, watching this woman care for his children with such natural tenderness, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't betrayal of Rebecca's memory, it was expansion of it. Sarah wasn't trying to replace his wife. She was honoring her by loving what Rebecca had loved most. For the first time since Rebecca's death, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than just survival. a future where his children could laugh without guilt, where his home could be filled with warmth again, where love might be possible without the constant fear of loss. But accepting Sarah's help meant accepting that he couldn't do everything alone. It meant trusting someone else with his family's well-being. It meant risking his heart on a woman who'd already proven she was willing to leave everything behind for the sake of strangers. As they returned to the main room, Daniel caught Sarah looking at Rebecca's photograph on the mantel with an expression of profound sadness and gratitude. "She was beautiful," Sarah said softly. "Yes, she was, inside and out." Daniel picked up the photograph, studying his wife's gentle smile. "She always said that love doesn't divide when it's shared. It multiplies. I never understood what she meant until now." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "She said the same thing to me. Word for word." In that moment, Daniel knew his decision was already made. Rebecca had chosen Sarah for reasons that went deeper than coincidence. His wife had seen something in this broken, brave woman that he was only beginning to understand. The question now wasn't whether to trust Sarah running bare with his family's future. The question was whether he was strong enough to accept the gift Rebecca had somehow managed to give them from beyond the grave. The morning after Sarah's revelation about Rebecca, Daniel woke to find her already gone from the cabin. Her bedroll was neatly folded by the fireplace and a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove. But there was no sign of her presence except for the lingering scent of the bread she'd baked before dawn. For a moment, panic seized him. Had she left during the night, overwhelmed by the weight of her confession? Then he heard voices outside, and looked through the window to see Sarah crouched in their vegetable garden with Mary and Samuel, showing them how to harvest the last of the winter squash before the first hard frost. Her dark hair was braided back practically, and she wore Rebecca's old gardening apron, something that should have felt like a violation but instead seemed like a benediction. "Papa!" Mary called when she spotted him in the doorway. "Miss Sarah says we can make pumpkin soup for dinner, and she knows how to dry the seeds for next year's planting." Daniel stepped onto the porch, noting how Sarah's shoulders tensed slightly at his approach. The easy comfort of the previous weeks had been replaced by uncertainty, as if her honesty had shifted the very foundation of their relationship. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Morning," Sarah replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "I hope you don't mind. I thought we should get the garden buttoned up before the weather turns." "Of course." Daniel watched her efficient movements as she showed the children how to cut the squash stems properly. "Sarah, about last night—" "You don't need to say anything," she interrupted quickly. "I know it changes things, knowing I came here with purpose instead of by accident. If you want me to leave, I understand." "Do you want to leave?" The question hung in the crisp morning air between them. Sarah straightened slowly, a winter squash cradled in her arms like a child. "No," she said quietly. "I don't want to leave. But I also don't want to stay if my presence causes you pain or makes you feel like you're betraying Rebecca's memory." "Mama never felt betrayed by love," came Joseph's voice from the corner of the garden where he was gathering dried bean pods. The 8-year-old's words carried a gravity that made both adults stop and stare. She used to say love was like seeds. The more you plant, the more beautiful things grow. Daniel felt his throat tighten at his son's wisdom. "When did your mother tell you that?" "Right before she got too sick to work in the garden anymore. She was showing me how to save seeds for next year, and I asked her if she was sad that she might not see them grow." Joseph's young face was serious, but not tragic. "She said she wouldn't be sad as long as we kept planting good things and taking care of what grew." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. "Your mother was a wise woman." "Yes, she was," Daniel agreed. "And she chose you to be here with us." I'm beginning to think I should trust her judgment. The words seemed to unlock something in Sarah's posture. She set down the squash and turned to face him fully. Does that mean you'll let me help with the bank debt? It means I'll consider it, but not as charity, as a loan. I'll pay you back, with interest, even if it takes years. And in the meantime? Daniel glanced at his children, who were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. In the meantime, I think we should see what grows. The next few days brought an unexpected visitor that tested Daniel's newfound resolve. Thomas Iron Horse arrived on a gray gelding just as the family was finishing breakfast, his weathered face grim with purpose. Daniel had known Thomas for years, a bitter man in his 50s who'd lost his own wife and children to cholera 3 years prior and seemed determined to spread his misery to anyone who dared to hope for better. "Daniel," Thomas said without preamble as he dismounted, "we need to talk." "Thomas!" Daniel stepped onto the porch, instinctively positioning himself between the visitor and his family. "What brings you out this way? Heard you've got yourself a woman living here. Folks in town are talking." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Folks in town should mind their own business. Maybe they should, but they don't. And when an unmarried woman shacks up with a widower, it reflects poorly on the whole community. Thomas's eyes moved past Daniel to where Sarah stood in the doorway, the children clustering around her skirts. "Especially when nobody knows nothing about where she comes from." "Miss Running Bear is the new school teacher?" Daniel said evenly, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's been helping my family while I recovered from an injury. There's nothing improper about it." Thomas snorted. "School teacher, my ass. I sent word to Denver, made some inquiries. Ain't no school board ever heard of her." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face, but before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward with quiet dignity. "You're quite right, Mr. Iron Horse. No school board hired me to come to Pine Ridge." "Sarah," Daniel warned, but she shook her head. "The truth is always better than deception," she said firmly. "I came here of my own accord to fulfill a promise I made to Rebecca Singing Bird before she died. She asked me to look after her family if anything happened to her." Thomas's expression grew ugly. "So you're some kind of charity caseworker? Coming to save the poor widower and his brats?" "Watch your tongue," Daniel growled, taking a step forward. But Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm someone who loved children and lost one," Sarah said simply. "Someone who needed to find purpose again after tragedy. Rebecca gave me that purpose when she asked me to help care for what she loved most in this world." "Convenient story," Thomas sneered, "especially since the dead can't contradict it." That's when Mary stepped out from behind Sarah's skirts, her small face flushed with indignation. "Miss Sarah's not lying. She knows all of Mama's songs, and she makes bread exactly like Mama did, and she knows things about us that nobody else knows." "Child, you don't understand." "I understand that you're being mean to Miss Sarah for no reason." Mary's voice rose with righteous anger. "And Mama always said mean people are just sad people who forgot how to be happy." The rebuke from a 5-year-old seemed to knock some of the wind out of Thomas's sails, but his expression remained hostile. "Pretty words don't change facts. This woman shows up out of nowhere right when you're facing foreclosure, claims she can solve all your problems with mysterious money. Seems mighty suspicious to me." "What money?" Daniel asked sharply, turning to Sarah. Sarah's face went pale. "Thomas, how did you—" "Like I said, I've been asking questions. Found out you withdrew a considerable sum from a Denver bank right before you left town. Makes a man wonder what kind of business you were really in." Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again. "Sarah, what is he talking about?" Before Sarah could answer, Thomas pressed his advantage. $3,000, Daniel. That's a lot of money for a simple school teacher to have lying around. Makes you wonder what she had to do to earn it." The insinuation hung in the air like a poison cloud. Daniel saw Sarah's face crumple with hurt and shame, and something fierce and protective rose in his chest. "Get off my land," he said quietly. "Daniel, you need to hear this." "Get off my land!" Daniel's voice thundered across the yard, causing Thomas's horse to shy nervously. "And don't come back. Next time you want to spread gossip and lies about a woman who's shown nothing but kindness to my family, you can do it somewhere else." Thomas mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. Mark my words. That woman's going to bring you nothing but trouble. Some secrets have a way of catching up with folks." As Thomas rode away, Daniel turned to find Sarah standing with her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face. The children clustered around her uncertainly, sensing the adult tension they couldn't fully understand. "Sarah," Daniel said gently, "the money Thomas mentioned. It's my inheritance," she whispered, "from my parents' estate. They died when I was 16 and the court put the money in trust until I turned 25. I only just gained access to it this year." "Then why didn't you tell me that before?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Because I've learned that money makes people suspicious. They start wondering what you want from them, what your real motives are. I wanted you to trust me for who I am, not what I have." Daniel studied her face, noting the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting another blow. "And the charity work in Denver, the orphanage, all true. I used some of the inheritance to keep the orphanage running after the fire. But when Emma died," Sarah's voice broke, "I couldn't stay there anymore." Everything reminded me of failure. "Miss Sarah," Mary said, tugging on her skirt, "why is that man so angry?" Sarah knelt to Mary's level, wiping her eyes. "Some people carry so much hurt inside them that it spills out onto others, sweetheart. Mr. Ironhorse lost his family and it made him forget how to see good things." "Like how Papa was after Mama died?" Joseph asked with uncomfortable insight. Daniel winced at the comparison, but Sarah nodded gently. "Yes, exactly like that. Grief can make us do things we're not proud of." As the family retreated into the cabin, Daniel found himself grappling with new doubts. Not about Sarah's character. Thomas's attack had only confirmed her goodness in his mind, but about the wisdom of accepting her help. If word spread about her money, it would only fuel more gossip, more suspicion. And if Thomas was right about secrets catching up with people. That evening, as Sarah tucked the children into bed with her usual gentle care, Daniel watched from the doorway and made a decision that would change everything. Whatever secrets Sarah might be carrying, whatever complications her money might bring, she belonged here. Rebecca had chosen her, the children loved her, and Daniel was falling in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somehow, in the midst of grief and struggle and day-to-day survival, love had crept in quietly and taken root. Not the desperate, passionate love he'd shared with Rebecca, but something deeper and more complex. A love built on shared purpose, mutual respect, and the gradual healing of two broken hearts. The question now was whether Sarah felt the same way, and whether they could build a future together despite the shadows gathering around them. The tragedy that would test every bond Sarah had carefully built with the Crow Feather family began with a simple decision on a bitterly cold November morning. Daniel had been tracking elk sign for 3 days, trying to secure enough meat to last through winter, when he spotted fresh wolf tracks circling dangerously close to the cabin. His protective instincts overrode caution, and despite Sarah's gentle protests about his barely healed shoulder, he set out alone with his rifle to eliminate the threat. The pack was larger than he'd anticipated, 6 wolves, lean and desperate as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. What should have been a careful hunt from a distance became a running battle when the alpha male charged instead of fleeing, Daniel's shot went wide due to his still tender shoulder, and suddenly he found himself surrounded by snarling predators with only 4 bullets left. The gunshots echoing across the valley sent Sarah running from the cabin, her heart hammering with dread. She found Daniel 2 hours later, conscious but badly mauled, his left leg torn open from knee to ankle where the pack leader had brought him down. The wolves lay dead around him, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. "Don't let the children see me like this," Daniel whispered through gritted teeth as Sarah knelt beside him in the blood-stained snow. His face was gray with shock and blood loss, and Sarah could see bone through the deepest gashes in his leg. "Can you move at all?" Sarah asked, already tearing strips from her petticoat to fashion tourniquets. "Leg's useless. Think something's torn inside." Daniel's breathing was shallow and rapid. "Sarah, if I don't make it—" "You're going to make it," Sarah said firmly, though privately she was calculating the grim odds. The nearest doctor was Dr. Patterson in Clearwater, a full day's ride in good weather. With the storm clouds gathering overhead and Daniel unable to ride, their options were desperately limited. The journey back to the cabin became a nightmare of endurance. Sarah managed to fashion a travois from fallen branches and her coat, but every bump and jolt sent fresh waves of agony through Daniel's injured leg. By the time they reached home, he was delirious with pain and fever. The children's faces at the window mirrored Sarah's own terror. Joseph stood frozen in the doorway, his 8-year-old mind struggling to process the sight of his father's blood soaking through the makeshift bandages. Mary began to cry in the specific, hopeless way that had become familiar after Rebecca's death. The sound of a child who'd learned too young that the people she loved could be taken away without warning. "Is Papa going to die like Mama did?" Samuel asked with the devastating directness of a 3-year-old, and Sarah felt her heart break all over again. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, praying it wasn't a lie. "Papa's hurt, but we're going to take very good care of him." The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of desperate nursing and barely controlled panic. Sarah cleaned and dressed Daniel's wounds every few hours, fighting infection with the limited medical supplies she'd brought from Denver. She forced willow bark tea down his throat for the fever and pain, staying awake around the clock to watch for signs of improvement or decline. The children responded to the crisis in their own ways. Joseph threw himself into adult responsibilities with frightening intensity, chopping wood until his small hands bled and insisting on checking the snares every morning. Mary retreated into silence, clutching her doll and watching Sarah's every movement with anxious eyes. Samuel became clingy and whiny, as if sensing that another pillar of his small world was threatening to crumble. On the 3rd night, Daniel's fever spiked dangerously high. He thrashed in delirium, calling out for Rebecca and speaking to people who weren't there. Sarah sat beside his bed with cold compresses, listening to his rambling words and fighting her own despair. "I can't do this again," she whispered to the darkness. "I can't lose another family." That's when she heard Joseph's voice from the children's room, speaking in hushed tones to his siblings. "Remember what Mama told us before she got too sick? She said sometimes people we love have to go away, but that doesn't mean they stop loving us. And she said we have to be brave and take care of each other." "But I don't want Papa to go away," Mary sobbed. "Me neither," Joseph admitted, his young voice cracking with emotion. "But Miss Sarah's doing everything she can to help him get better, and maybe if we're really good and help her, Papa will stay." The innocent faith in his words cut Sarah to the bone. These children had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The thought of them suffering that loss again, this time while she stood helplessly by, was unbearable. By dawn, Daniel's fever had broken, but his leg showed ominous signs of infection. The wound edges were angry and swollen, and Sarah could smell the sickly, sweet odor that meant gangrene might be setting in. Without proper surgical intervention, he could lose the leg, or worse. "Sarah," Daniel said weakly when consciousness fully returned. "Tell me honestly, how bad is it?" She met his eyes directly, knowing he deserved the truth. "Bad. The infection is spreading faster than I can fight it with herbs and poultices. You need a real doctor, and you need one soon. Then go get Dr. Patterson. I can't leave you alone with the children, not like this, and I can't take them on a day-long ride in this weather." Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them both. What about Henrik? Could he? Henrik's been laid up with pneumonia for 2 weeks. Elizabeth Wintermoon told me yesterday. They sat in silence, each understanding what the other couldn't bring themselves to say. Without medical intervention, Daniel might die, but seeking that intervention meant risking the children's safety and abandoning him when he needed care most. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything. Thomas Ironhorse appeared at their door, his face grim but lacking its usual malicious satisfaction. Behind him rode Dr. Patterson himself, along with 2 other men Sarah didn't recognize. "Daniel Crow Feather," Dr. Patterson said as he dismounted. "I understand you've got yourself in quite a predicament." "Doc?" Daniel's voice was weak but surprised. "How did you know?" "Mr. Ironhorse here rode through a blizzard to fetch me," Patterson explained, setting down his medical bag. "Said you were hurt bad and had children depending on you." Sarah stared at Thomas in shock. This was the same man who'd tried to drive a wedge between her and Daniel just days before, yet he'd risked his own safety to bring help. Thomas caught her expression and looked away uncomfortably. "A man can be wrong about things," he muttered. "Doesn't mean he wants to see children orphaned." Dr. Patterson's examination confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "The infection's taken hold pretty good," he said quietly, drawing her aside. "I can clean it out, but he's going to lose some of the muscle, maybe more, and there's no guarantee the infection won't come back." "What are his chances?" "With proper care, maybe 60%. Without it?" The doctor shrugged meaningfully. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. 60% wasn't good odds when 3 children's futures hung in the balance, but it was better than the alternative. As Dr. Patterson prepared for surgery on the kitchen table, Sarah gathered the children and tried to explain what was happening. Their scared faces reminded her of her own terror as a child when uncertainty had ruled her world. "Is Papa going to be all right?" Mary whispered. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah answered honestly. "But we're going to hope and pray and do everything we can to help him." Outside, the first blizzard of winter began to howl around the cabin, trapping them all together as they faced the longest night of their lives. The surgery on Daniel's leg lasted 4 grueling hours, performed by lamplight on the kitchen table while wind howled around the cabin like a living thing. Dr. Patterson worked with grim efficiency, cutting away infected tissue while Sarah assisted and Thomas kept the children occupied in the front room. The smell of carbolic acid mixed with wood smoke and the metallic scent of blood, creating an atmosphere that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. When it was over, Dr. Patterson washed his hands in silence before delivering his verdict. "I've done what I can, but the next 48 hours will tell the tale. If the infection doesn't return and he doesn't develop blood poisoning, he might keep the leg, might even walk on it again, though he'll have a pronounced limp." Sarah nodded, too exhausted to speak. Through the bedroom doorway she could see Daniel's still form under Rebecca's wedding quilt, his face waxy and pale in the flickering candlelight. The children had finally fallen asleep in a pile on the sofa, worn out by fear and uncertainty. "Miss Running Bear," Dr. Patterson said quietly. "I need to ask you something that might seem impertinent." "Go ahead." "Thomas tells me there's been talk about your relationship with Daniel, about money you supposedly have access to. Now, I don't put much stock in gossip, but I need to know, are you prepared to see this through? Because that man in there is going to need months of care, and those children are going to need stability more than ever." Sarah looked at Thomas, who was studiously avoiding her gaze while banking the fire. "I'm not going anywhere, Dr. Patterson. This family is my responsibility now. Even if it costs you that money everyone's talking about. Medical care doesn't come cheap, and Daniel won't be able to work for a long while." Even then, the doctor studied her face in the lamplight, seeming to find what he was looking for. "All right, then. I'll be back in a week to check on him, weather permitting. In the meantime, keep those wounds clean and watch for signs of fever returning." After Dr. Patterson left, Sarah found herself alone with Thomas for the first time since his confrontation at the cabin. The wind continued to rage outside, ensuring that no one would be traveling anywhere for at least another day. "Why?" Sarah asked simply. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Lost my own wife and boy to cholera 3 years back," he said finally. "Watched them die slow and painful while I stood by helpless. Guess it made me bitter toward folks who still had what I'd lost. That doesn't explain why you helped us tonight, doesn't it?" Thomas turned to look at her, his weathered face showing every one of his 50-odd years. Saw those children's faces when they thought they might lose their papa. Remembered what it felt like to be that scared and helpless. He paused. Remembered what it felt like to watch someone fight that hard to save people they loved. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, I'm sorry about your family. Not your fault, but maybe—" He struggled with the words. "Maybe I was wrong about you. Takes a special kind of person to ride into someone else's troubles and make them your own." The next morning brought a devastating discovery that shattered what little peace Sarah had found in Thomas's change of heart. While checking on Daniel's condition, she found a letter tucked under his pillow. A letter addressed to her in Rebecca's familiar handwriting dated just 2 days before her death. With trembling hands, Sarah unfolded the paper and read words that would change everything she thought she knew about her presence in the Crow-Feather family. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then you have kept your promise and found my family. But there is something I could not tell you in the hospital, something I pray you will understand when you learn the truth. You are not here by chance, and I did not choose you randomly from among the volunteers. Thomas Iron Horse is your father, Sarah. The same Thomas who abandoned your mother when she was pregnant with you, the same man who has spent 30 years running from the guilt of that choice. I have been watching him for months, seeing how his bitterness consumes him, how his regret over losing you has poisoned every relationship he's tried to build since. When I learned about you from the hospital staff, learned your name and your story, I knew God had given me a chance to heal more than one broken family. Thomas needs to know he has a daughter who survived and thrived despite his abandonment. He needs to see that love can grow even in the hardest soil. And you, sweet Sarah, need to understand that you are not destined to save everyone. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply allowing yourself to be loved. I cannot force forgiveness between you and Thomas, but I can give you the chance to choose it. What you do with this knowledge is between you and your conscience. But please remember that my children need you regardless of who your father is or what mistakes he has made. With all my love and gratitude, Rebecca Singing Bird. P.S. The bread recipe I taught you was my mother's, passed down through 4 generations of Cherokee women. When you bake it in my kitchen, you carry forward a tradition of love that transcends blood. Sarah sank into the chair beside Daniel's bed, the letter falling from nerveless fingers. Thomas Iron Horse was her father. The bitter, angry man who had tried to drive her away from the only happiness she'd found in years was the same person who had abandoned her pregnant mother decades ago. The irony was almost unbearable. She had spent her entire adult life wondering about her father, imagining him as either a hero or a monster, never suspecting that she would meet him while he was actively trying to destroy her newfound family. And Rebecca, wise, dying Rebecca, had orchestrated this reunion with the patient manipulation of a woman who understood that some truths could only be revealed when hearts were ready to receive them. "Sarah?" Daniel's weak voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had. "Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. About Thomas. About why I really came here." With halting words, Sarah explained Rebecca's final letter, watching Daniel's face cycle through confusion, understanding, and finally, a kind of awed recognition. When she finished, they sat in silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the children's soft breathing from the next room. "So Rebecca knew," Daniel said finally. "She knew Thomas was your father when she asked you to come here. She orchestrated everything. My meeting you, Thomas's suspicion and anger, even this moment when we'd finally learn the truth." Sarah's voice was bitter with hurt and admiration. "She played us all like pieces on a chessboard." "No," Daniel said firmly, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "She gave us all choices. She didn't force Thomas to ride through a blizzard to save my life. She didn't force you to stay and care for us. She didn't force me to fall in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. Sarah's heart stopped, then began beating so fast she felt dizzy. "Daniel, I love you, Sarah Running Bear. I've been fighting it for weeks because I felt guilty about Rebecca, guilty about the children, guilty about being a broken-down hunter with more debts than prospects. But nearly dying has a way of clarifying what matters." His green eyes were fierce with determination, despite his weakness. "Rebecca brought you to us because she knew we needed you. All of us, including Thomas." Through the window, Sarah could see Thomas splitting wood in the yard with methodical precision, unaware that his daughter was 20 feet away grappling with the knowledge of their connection. Soon she would have to face him, would have to decide whether forgiveness was possible after 30 years of abandonment and a lifetime of wondering. But first she had to answer the question in Daniel's eyes, the hope and fear that made him look younger than his 34 years. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling like a prayer and a promise combined. "I love you and Joseph and Mary and Samuel. I love this cabin and this life and even this impossible situation Rebecca created." Daniel reached for her hand with his uninjured arm, pulling her down to sit on the edge of the bed. "Then marry me. Not because you feel obligated to Rebecca's memory, or because the children need a mother, but because I can't imagine a future without you in it. Daniel, people will say I'm taking advantage, that I'm using your injury and your debt to trap you into marriage. Let them say whatever they want. I know the truth, and so do you." His grip on her hand tightened. "The truth is that love doesn't always come when it's convenient or expected. Sometimes it comes disguised as tragedy and loss and impossible coincidences." Outside, Thomas continued chopping wood, each strike of the axe marking time until Sarah would have to confront the father who had given her life and then walked away from it. But for this moment, in this room where death had been held at bay by stubborn love and skilled hands, Sarah allowed herself to believe in happy endings, even the ones that came wrapped in 30 years of pain and the matchmaking schemes of a dying woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The conversation with Thomas took place 3 days later, when Daniel was strong enough to sit up for extended periods and the children were outside building snow forts in the crisp December air. Sarah had carried Rebecca's letter in her pocket like a burning coal, its weight growing heavier with each passing hour. She found Thomas in the barn, mending a broken harness with the methodical precision of a man who used physical tasks to avoid difficult emotions. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly from the doorway, "we need to talk." He looked up from his work, noting something in her tone that made him set down his tools. "About what?" Sarah pulled the letter from her pocket, its edges soft from handling. "About Rebecca. About why she really asked me to come here. About you." Thomas's face went carefully blank, the way it did when he was preparing for emotional pain. "I don't know what you mean." "She knew, Thomas." "Rebecca knew exactly who you were when she told me about your daughter in Denver. She knew you were my father." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the trembling in her hands. "She arranged everything. My coming here. Your reaction to my presence. Even this moment when we'd finally face the truth." The harness slipped from Thomas's numb fingers, hitting the barn floor with a dull thud. For a long moment the only sounds were the children's distant laughter and the soft nickering of horses in their stalls. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. "Your mother, Mary Dove? She died in childbirth. The midwife told me the baby died too. The midwife lied to protect me from a father who'd already proven he could abandon his responsibilities." Sarah's voice carried 30 years of accumulated pain. "My mother lived long enough to give birth and name me. I was raised by her sister until I was 12, then went to the mission school in Denver when she died of consumption." Thomas aged a decade in the space of a breath. His weathered hands shook as he reached for the barn wall to steady himself. "All these years, God in heaven, all these years I thought you were dead. I thought I'd killed you both with my cowardice. Why did you leave her?" The question Sarah had carried her entire life finally found voice. "Why did you run when she needed you most?" Thomas sank onto a hay bale, his face gray with old shame. "I was 22 years old and scared out of my mind. Your mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, Cherokee and Irish like you, with eyes that could see right through to a man's soul. But I was fresh back from fighting in the Indian Wars, and my head was full of poison about mixed marriages and half-breed children." Sarah flinched at the slur, but Thomas continued, his voice raw with regret. "The other soldiers, they filled my head with talk about how mixed children never belonged anywhere, how they'd be rejected by both worlds. And God forgive me, I believed them. I convinced myself I was protecting you both by leaving, that you'd be better off without a broken soldier for a father. So you abandoned a pregnant woman to raise a child alone in 1857. Sarah's voice was flat with controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what that meant for her? What people called her? What they called me?" "I thought about you every day," Thomas said desperately. "Every single day for 30 years. I tried to come back once when you would have been about 5, but the midwife told me you'd both died, said it was God's punishment for my sins. And you believed her rather than looking for proof." "I wanted to believe her," Thomas admitted, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "Because if you were dead, I couldn't hurt you anymore. I couldn't fail you the way I'd failed your mother." Sarah studied her father's broken posture, seeing for the first time not the bitter antagonist who'd tried to destroy her happiness, but a man who'd been carrying 30 years of guilt and self-hatred. It didn't excuse his actions, but it explained the particular venom with which he'd attacked her relationship with Daniel. "You weren't trying to protect Daniel from me," Sarah realized. "You were trying to protect me from him. You were afraid he'd abandon me the way you abandoned my mother." Thomas's nod was barely perceptible. "When I saw how happy his children were with you, how much they needed you, it terrified me. because I knew how easy it would be for a man to walk away when things got difficult. I know because I did it. But Daniel isn't you, Thomas, and I'm not my mother." "No," Thomas agreed, lifting his head to meet her eyes for the first time. "You're stronger than both of us. You came here to honor a dying woman's request, and you stayed when things got complicated. You risked your life to save a man you barely knew, and you've loved his children like they were your own blood." The barn fell silent except for the soft sounds of animals settling for the evening. Outside, Sarah could hear Daniel calling the children in for supper, his voice still weak but growing stronger each day. "Rebecca left something else in her letter," Sarah said finally. "She said forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing to build something new instead of staying trapped in old pain." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, the first Sarah had ever seen from the stern, bitter man. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But if there's any chance, if there's any way I could earn the right to be called your father—" "There is," Sarah said quietly. "But it won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. You've spent 30 years believing you were worthless, and I've spent 30 years wondering if I was unwanted. We both have to learn how to be family. How do we start?" Sarah looked around the barn, noting the careful way Thomas had repaired not just his own equipment but several pieces belonging to Daniel. "We start by being honest about who we are now, not who we were 30 years ago. And we start by working together to build something good for the people we both love. Daniel's asked you to marry him." It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it as one. "Yes, and I've accepted." "Good," Thomas said firmly. "He's a better man than I ever was, and those children deserve to have you as their mother. They deserve to have their grandfather, too, if he's willing to do the work of earning their trust." Thomas wiped his eyes with a calloused hand. "What about the money? Your inheritance? What about it? Daniel's too proud to take it as charity." "But if it came as a wedding gift from your father—" Thomas's voice trailed off hopefully. Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine smile she'd directed at Thomas since meeting him. "You want to pay Daniel's debts as a dowry? I want to give my daughter a wedding gift that ensures her happiness. If that means clearing the way for her to marry the man she loves without financial worry, then yes." Thomas' iron horse offering to spend money on someone else's happiness? Rebecca would be amazed. Rebecca was a wise woman who saw things the rest of us were too blind or stubborn to recognize. Thomas stood slowly, his movements careful as if testing whether this new reality would hold. "She saw that you and I needed each other, even if we were too damaged to see it ourselves." That evening, the family gathered around the kitchen table for the first time since Daniel's injury. He was still pale and moved carefully, but his eyes were bright with determination as Sarah helped him to his chair. The children chattered about their snow fort construction, their voices light with the resilience of youth. "I have an announcement," Daniel said when the initial flurry of dinner conversation died down. "Sarah and I are going to be married." Joseph's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Really? Miss Sarah's going to be our new mama?" "If you'll have me," Sarah said gently. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Mary launched herself from her chair to wrap her arms around Sarah's neck, while Samuel clapped his hands and shouted, "Mama Sarah! Mama Sarah!" Joseph, trying to maintain his dignity as the eldest, simply grinned and said, "I think that's about the best news we've had in a long time." "There's more," Sarah said, glancing at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "Thomas has offered to pay off our debt to the bank as a wedding gift." Daniel's expression grew wary. "Sarah, we talked about this. I won't take charity." "It's not charity," Thomas interrupted gruffly. It's a father giving his daughter what she needs to start her married life without financial burden. Besides, he added with a shadow of his old humor, I've got more money than I know what to do with and no one to leave it to. Might as well put it to good use. Thomas is my father, Sarah said simply, watching the children's faces register surprise and confusion. We only just discovered it ourselves. Rebecca knew all along. It's why she brought us all together. So that means Mr. Thomas is going to be our grandfather? Mary asked, her child's mind quickly working through the implications. If he wants to be, Sarah said carefully. Thomas looked around the table at three young faces turned toward him with curious expectation. For a man who'd spent 30 years believing he was unworthy of family connections, the moment was overwhelming. I'd be honored, he said hoarsely, though I should warn you, I'm pretty rusty at the grandfather business. That's okay, Samuel announced with 3-year-old authority. Papa was rusty at the papa business after Mama died, but Miss Sarah helped him remember how. The simple wisdom of a child's observation brought tears to several adult eyes. Daniel reached across the table to take Sarah's hand, his grip warm and sure despite his recent brush with death. When? He asked simply. Christmas Eve, Sarah replied. If the weather permits, we'll have Pastor Williams come from Clearwater. If not, Thomas can marry us himself. He's a licensed justice of the peace. A Christmas wedding, Mary breathed, her eyes shining, like in a fairy tale. Better than a fairy tale, Daniel said, lifting Sarah's hand to his lips. Because this is real. As the family settled into evening routines, Thomas teaching Joseph to properly care for the horses, Sarah braiding Mary's hair for bed, Daniel reading to Samuel from a worn book of children's stories, the cabin filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Outside, snow continued to fall in gentle spirals, blanketing the Colorado wilderness in pristine white. But inside, surrounded by the people she loved and the father she'd never expected to find, Sarah felt a peace that had eluded her for 30 years. Rebecca's final gift hadn't been just a family for Sarah, or a mother for the children, or even a wife for Daniel. It had been the chance for all of them, including Thomas, to learn that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies, creating something larger and more beautiful than any of them could have built alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the ongoing work of healing and building trust and learning to be a blended family. But tonight, as the first Christmas Eve of their new life together approached, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happily ever after, even the kind that came wrapped in 30 years of secrets and orchestrated by a dying woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let the people you care about settle for anything less than joy. Message for American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest pain. Like Daniel Crowfeather, many of us have faced moments when we thought our capacity for love had died with those we lost. We convince ourselves that second chances are for younger people, that our broken hearts are too damaged to risk again. But Sarah's story reminds us that love doesn't have an expiration date. At 55, 60, or beyond, we still deserve happiness. We still deserve to wake up each morning with purpose, to feel needed, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what we've lost. The Cherokee saying Rebecca shared holds true. Love doesn't divide when it's shared. It multiplies. Whether you're a widow wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, a grandfather questioning your worth after mistakes, or simply someone who believes your best days are behind you, remember that every sunrise offers a new chance to choose hope over resignation. Your story isn't over. Your heart isn't too old to heal. And somewhere out there, love is still looking for you, maybe disguised as a loaf of bread, maybe wrapped in an unexpected friendship, but always always worth the risk. Discussion questions. Have you ever experienced a second chance at love or happiness that came when you least expected it? What would you tell someone your age who believes it's too late for new beginnings? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows and painting everything in shades of gold and crystal. Sarah woke before sunrise, her heart pounding with nervous excitement as she realized this was her wedding day, the day she would officially become part of the Crow Feather family and begin the life she'd never dared to dream possible. The cabin buzzed with quiet activity as everyone prepared for the ceremony. Thomas had ridden to Clearwater the day before, returning with Pastor Williams, a bolt of white silk, and news that half the town planned to attend the wedding despite the winter weather. Word had spread about the dramatic romance, the school teacher who'd saved the wounded hunter, the bitter man who'd turned out to be her father, the children who'd found a mother in their darkest hour. "Folks are calling it a Christmas miracle," Pastor Williams had said with a smile, "though I suspect there was more earthly planning involved than most miracles require." Now, as Sarah stood before Rebecca's mirror brushing her hair, she could hear Daniel moving carefully around the main room, his injured leg still requiring caution, but his spirits soaring. The children's excited whispers drifted from their bedroom, where they were helping each other dress in their Sunday best. "You look beautiful," came a voice from the doorway. Sarah turned to find Thomas holding a wooden box, his expression soft with paternal pride. "I have something for you, something that belonged to your mother." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the box to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant, distinctly Cherokee in its simple elegance. "I bought this for Mary Dove the day I learned she was carrying you," Thomas said quietly. "She was wearing it when I left. I found it among her things after she died, and kept it all these years, thinking it was all I'd ever have of either of you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as Thomas fastened the necklace around her throat. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you, Papa." The words seemed to transform something in Thomas's weathered face. "I never thought I'd hear that word spoken in love instead of anger or sorrow." "Well, get used to it," Sarah said with a watery smile. "You're stuck with me now." The ceremony took place in the main room of the cabin, which had been transformed with pine boughs and candles into something magical. Daniel stood waiting by the fireplace, handsome in his best suit, despite the cane he now required for support. His children flanked him, Joseph serious and proud in his role as best man, Mary beaming in a new dress that Thomas had commissioned from the town seamstress, and Samuel clutching a basket of pine needles to scatter instead of flower petals. As Sarah walked toward them on Thomas's arm, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a broken woman working in a Denver orphanage, convinced that her capacity for love had died with the children she couldn't save. Now she was about to marry a man who'd shown her that healing was possible, surrounded by children who'd taught her that families could be built as well as born. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed cabin, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two hearts that have found their way to each other through trials that might have destroyed lesser loves. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, promising not just traditional love and loyalty, but understanding born of shared loss, patience learned through grief, and the courage to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken. Do you, Daniel Crowfeather, take Sarah Running Bear to be your wife, knowing that she comes to you not to replace what you've lost, but to help you create something new and beautiful?" "I do," Daniel said firmly, his green eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "With all my heart and for all my days." "Do you, Sarah Running Bear?" Take Daniel Crowfeather to be your husband, accepting not just him, but the sacred responsibility of mothering his children and honoring the memory of the woman who brought you to them? I do, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. I promise to love all of you with everything I have. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cabin erupted in cheers and applause. Daniel's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and Sarah felt the last walls around her heart crumble completely. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Pine Ridge had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in town: roasted venison, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and a wedding cake that Elizabeth Winter Moon had somehow managed to create despite the winter isolation. Children ran between the adults' legs, their laughter mixing with fiddle music and the steady hum of conversation. Sarah found herself moving through the crowd in a daze of happiness, accepting congratulations and good wishes from people who had become her community. Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile pressed her hand warmly and said that Rebecca always did know how to arrange things just right. Henrik Mueller, recovered from his pneumonia, made a gruff toast about second chances being sweeter than first ones. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Sarah stood on the porch watching families make their way home through the snow. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the darkness, and she could hear voices calling out final Christmas greetings and wedding wishes. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, joining her with his arm around her waist. "Only that Rebecca couldn't be here to see it," Sarah replied honestly, "though somehow I think she is." "I know she is," Daniel said with certainty. "She's in every choice that brought us together, every moment of love we share with her children, every day we choose hope over fear." Inside the cabin, Thomas was teaching the children a card game, while the remnants of the wedding feast waited to be cleared away. It was a scene of such domestic contentment that Sarah had to blink back fresh tears. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we live," Daniel said simply. "We raise our children, build our life together, and trust that love really does multiply when it's shared freely." "Our children," Sarah repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that. Well, you'd better get used to it, Mrs. Crowfeather. You're going to be hearing it for the next 60 years or so." As they stood together on the threshold of their new life, snow beginning to fall again in gentle spirals, Sarah marveled at how completely her world had changed since that October morning when she'd ridden into Daniel's life with nothing but a loaf of bread and a dying woman's request. She had come to Pine Ridge to fulfill a promise, but she had found something infinitely more precious. A family that needed her as much as she needed them, a love that had grown from the ashes of loss, and a future bright with possibility. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth and light, filled with the voices of the people she loved most in the world. Ahead lay whatever challenges and joys the years might bring. But for this moment, this perfect Christmas Eve when everything had finally fallen into place, Sarah Crowfeather was exactly where she belonged. The hunter who'd lost everything had found it all again, and the woman who'd wandered so long had finally come home.